So as you can see in the title of my talk, I'm going to raise the question, is enough data really enough? And I'm going to leave the answer to the audience, so that's not my task at the end of the talk. But let's begin by my origins, not geographically, but scientifically. I come from BASCAT, which is the yellow building you see here. And why the name BASCAT? BASCAT is the joint lab between BASF, chemical company, and Technical University of Berlin. And what we do at BASCAT is basically catalysis research. So to put it in a nutshell, you can say catalysis research is based on 3 pillars: catalyst synthesis, which makes making the catalyst, catalytic test, and catalytic characterization, which means taking your catalyst to the lab and try to identify its properties. Now, if you ask what is my role in all these 3 steps, I would say none of them. But they still keep paying me every month. The reason is that my task is to look into the data that are produced in each of these 3 steps. So that makes me a data scientist, so to say. But I believe all of us, each of the persons in the audience, are in a sense a data scientist because we try to learn from the data in our day-to-day life. So if you're working in a research facility or if you're a student of any kind, you have been working with different sorts of data, you do different things during the day. But at the end of the day, what you want to do is to be able to narrow things down to the action that you take, the result that it produces, and being able to interpret that. Imagine your supervisor comes to you, for example, and tasks you for making a catalyst with bigger particles. So what you do, you go ahead in the lab, you use synthesis method A, and then you look at the results, you say, hey, great, I got bigger particles. So that makes you happy. But before you go to your supervisor and announce the good news, you say, I want to be sure. So what you do, you take another synthesis method. Let's call it synthesis method B. You get smaller particles. So you say, okay, that's not good. I'm happy. Now I can go to my supervisor and say, I found a solution. I found a correlation between cause and effect. Now, this, if you have done a PhD or research or a master thesis or a bachelor thesis, you have probably seen this scenario, which I'm going to call, of course, however, which is not a very comfortable one. So you go to your supervisor, you say, hey, I found these good results. And your supervisor tells you, of course, however, did you look into everything? Did you look at all the possible things that could go wrong? And this is, unfortunately, most of the times the case. So before I go any further, I want to highlight the importance of data in this sense. We will be talking about data a lot. I will be referring to this, of course, however, situation again. So to do this, I like to say that we have to always ask this question. Does correlation actually mean causation? And I'm going to quote a sentence from one of my favorite authors, Noah Harrari. In his book, A Brief History of Humankind, Noah Harrari says many, many nice things, and one that stuck with me was this sentence. Those who own the data own the future. As a naive PhD student, I read this and I told myself, of course those who own the data own the future. However, who created the data? What device was used? Is the measurement accurate? Do I know everything? And if you're a PhD candidate for a couple of years, you start to become suspicious of many things. So you will throw many questions like this before you come to any conclusions. So all these questions, all these data about data, we call them metadata. So if you think of data as tip of an iceberg, you could go ahead and say metadata is all beneath the surface, which we do not actually see with the first glance. So let's put that in research perspective. Imagine, again, your supervisor comes to you and says, hey, here are 2 catalysts. We received them from our partners. Let's look at the results and see who or which catalyst is better. So you look at the results, you see catalyst A gives you 10% yield. Catalyst B, on the other hand, gives you 30% yield. So it's very clear. Catalyst B is giving you 20% higher yield. Of course you have a better catalyst. However, you did not look into everything. So your supervisor comes to you again and says, hey, before we make any conclusions, go in the lab and make sure that everybody did everything for these 2 catalysts the same. If you want to be sure, especially in the industry, it's very important to not run into any conclusions. So you go in the lab, ask your colleague who tested the catalyst, did you use the same test conditions? You say, yeah, temperature, pressure, everything the same. Perfect. Next step, did you use the same volume of the catalyst? Same amount? Yes, perfect. Keep asking these questions until you get to the very first step, which was making the catalyst. And you ask your colleague, hey, did you use the same synthesis method? No. So that ruins it for you. So you take the same catalyst with the same synthesis method, test them again, and in the end, you realize that there's only 3% higher yield. This is actually a true story with pretty close numbers to reality. So again, we are back to point one, data. So we say, okay, lessons learned. Data is important. More important is metadata. So we collect as many metadata as possible. That's the key. Of course, metadata is amazing. However, not always. Let's give you an example. So imagine you want to train a machine learning model to recognize pictures of a horse. So what would you do in this case? For training, you provide as many pictures for a horse as possible. And you know your lesson. You provide as much metadata as you can. You tell the machine who took the picture, where this picture was taken. Is the horse smiling or is it running? You provide all this information to have a strong, powerful model. And in machine learning world, it is very common to train a model and then test the model to see how it is doing. So we do that. We show it some pictures of horses that it has not seen before, and you say, why not throw a picture of your cousin that you took with your Canon camera? Of course it's going to say, this is not a horse. So you start checking. The first two pictures, the machine tells you, hey, this is a horse. Okay, good. Everything is working. And you look at a picture of your cousin, and the machine tells you, yeah, this is a horse. But you're very, very certain, this is your cousin Jeff. It's not a horse. And then you look at the next picture, which is a horse, but the machine tells you it's not a horse. So something went wrong. But what? Definitely in the training process. So you go back to your training, you look at everything that you provided for the machine, and you realize, I gave it a piece of metadata which should not have been there. And that is the brand of the camera which was used actually to take those pictures. So if you could, give the brand of the camera, which is common feature for many of those pictures, the machine starts to take that as a common feature for a horse. And you took the picture of your cousin also with the same camera. So, yeah, that's obvious why the machine recognized that as a horse as well. So, again, we go one step back. So maybe not everything is good in terms of providing metadata. We cannot say that still. Let's look at one last example. And this is a story that a colleague of mine told me a while ago about an urban myth. So whether or not it is true, I cannot really say. It's a story about a galvanization plant. So this galvanization plant in our story, they have different parts. We can summarize it into surface preparation, which has 4 or 5 paths, galvanization process itself, and then inspection before you ship everything to the customer. So what this galvanization company did was all right. Everything was working for 2 years. So they started day 0, customer is happy, product is good. Year 2, year 3, they just keep producing everything amazing. Until one day, they realize that the customers are not happy, and they look into the product, and they see that it is actually not as good as it was before. The next batch the same, next batch the same. So, of course, they have to find out what is wrong. So they go inspect everything, they make sure everything is done the same, and they don't find anything. They make meetings after meetings after meetings. So they sit together, they just go into every single bath and check if something was changed, somebody is doing something different. They don't find anything. So in the end, somebody comes and say, hey, on the exact same day that we started to have these issues with the quality, we fired the night shift guard. Maybe this guy knows something. And everybody says, of course not. What does a night shift guard knows about the quality? However, let's see why he was fired. So they just go look into his file, take it out, and they read very carefully the reason for him being fired. And it appears this guy worked in the night shift. He got bored. And at the end of his shift, before he left, he just had 1-2 cans of beer. And his very last task was to go one by one, check every single bath, make sure everything is correct, everything's working, and then head home. So the guy did this for 2 years, every time that he left. But when he was leaving, he was so far from the bathrooms, and he had 2-3 beers. So he really needed to go to the bathroom. So what he did, instead of going back to the bathroom, he just did his business somewhere on the side, which he thought goes to the sewage, which in fact went to the molten zinc bath and increased the acidity of the molten zinc bath. So the moral of the story, of course, is to check everything, but this story is just an example of needing to know every single detail and try to do our best in interpreting. I'm going to end my talk with, let's call it lessons learned. So with all this information, how do we do metadata check in science or in research? I would summarize it into 2 main things. First, I would say we have to always define what we need. Coming back to the pillars of catalysis research, we have synthesis, test, and analytics or characterization. What we do is we try to define 2 layers of information. The first layer is those that we must have. So we need them before we make any final calls. And the second layer is those which are nice to have. So maybe the guard and what he did, that was nice to have, of course, but it's usually not a must-have. The second example is to reduce error or the possibility to make error. And I'm going to use an example of the aviation industry. In the aviation industry, when an airplane wants to take off, there's always an engineer who checks the engines. So one engineer goes and checks the left engine, makes sure everything is fine. But suppose this engineer is sleepy or is prone to make a systematic error. So what they do, they never send the same engineer to check the other engine. We try to do something similar also in the research world. So we always try to have one person producing metadata, the other person check the correctness or completeness, and so on and so forth. So with that, I would like to thank the audience and for your attention.